Hi, everybody. My name is Nick Marshall, and I'm the head of exhibitions and programs at the George Eastman Museum. Welcome to today's virtual talk with Lillian Jones, who is the Boyer Project Cataloguer in the Department of Photography here at the museum. Some of you may recognize Lillian from her previous In Focus talk a few months ago that she did with Maria Salinas, as the two of them discussed their work photographing and cataloging the Alvin Scott Boyer collection, which again in the Department of Photography here. If you're not familiar with our In Focus series, the program highlights projects going on around the museum that often happen behind closed doors, really just kind of provide a deeper dive into some of our exhibitions and programs, give you a bit of a unique perspective. Similarly to today's talk, where Lily will discuss her curation of the photographs in the current selections from the collection gallery. That installation has an overarching theme of travel and tourism, and it opened last weekend. And lucky for everybody, you'll have a good long while to see it. It's up through Labor Day of 2022. So if you get a chance, encourage you all to come in if you're in the area and feeling comfortable with coming in. We welcome you all. If you have questions at any point throughout today's talk, please submit them through the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. At the end of Lillian's talk, we'll go through as many of your questions that we have time for. If you'd like to use the chat function to say hello, drop us a line, please feel free to do so on there. It's always kind of fun to see conversations spring up on there. But if you do have any questions that are specifically for Lillian, please put them in the Q&A. It's just easier to track things that way for us. We are recording today's webinar, and we'll be putting it on our YouTube channel in the coming weeks. So if you'd like to go back and watch it again or share with others, you'll be able to access it along with our other webinars and video content through YouTube. And we do have the closed captioning function enabled. This is a function that Zoom offers. A great function to be able to have. If you'd like to turn it off or turn it on, there's a CC icon, either probably at the bottom top side of your screen. And you can just click on that and you have the ability to turn on or disable it from there. And I do want to note that the Zoom's closed captioning is, like I said, it's a great feature, but sometimes it's not the most accurate at interpretation, particularly with a lot of the technical language specific to photography. So I apologize in advance if it seems that there's some strange translations going on. And with that, I will turn it over to my colleague, Lillian Jones, who will be kicking things off. Lily?
Hello, I'm Lily Jones. And I would just like to start off by saying that my project here, preserving and improving access to the Boyer collection, has been made possible in part by a major grant from the National Endowment for the Humanities, Democracy Demands Wisdom. And I curated this round of selections from the collection, which is typically focused on the history of photography, using photographs from our collection here at the Eastman Museum. And we have a very large collection. We're talking hundreds of thousands of objects. So to narrow down what I was looking for to include in this exhibit, I decided to look at the history of photography through the lens of tourism. And I conceived of this idea when we were still pretty locked down, and it was almost winter. And I'm a cataloger, so my typical day is spent going through photographs. And I was looking at a lot of photographs of like Egypt and places in Europe, and even just like Harper's Ferry, West Virginia, and being like, man, I wish I could go there. And as someone who loves to travel and was stuck at home and thinking about this exhibit, I was like, maybe everyone could use a little escapism. And I also lived for a while in Santa Fe, New Mexico, which is a big tourist town. So it's a topic I have given a lot of thought to. And I like to think a lot about how multifaceted tourism is and what its impacts are. Like economically, it's a huge and important industry in so many places, but also it can create this sort of myth of a place, an idealized version of a place that can have many impacts on the people who live there. And I just think it's a really interesting topic to explore in conjunction with photography because of how entwined the history of the two is. Both how the industry of tourism uses photography, but also how the individual tourist uses photography. So I narrowed it down to one topic, tourism, but then within that bubble of tourism, there's still a lot of ground to cover. So I further narrowed it down to focus on just a few aspects of tourism. So I am looking at the Grand Tour, which was like an educational tour in the 18th and 19th century. And I was also looking at like national parks. I think the topic of tourism in natural spaces is really interesting and complex. And it also means I got to look at a lot of pieces by Ansel Adams. I also tried to thread the idea of cultural tourism throughout, and that idea that the tourist is consuming culture as they visit these places. And also just I added in some little fun things like tourist traps and like road trip culture as well, because there is so many great photographs about tourism in this collection. But our first object is a stereograph, a daguerreotype. And I'm kind of obsessed with stereographs, I cannot lie. The Boyer collection, which I am cataloging, includes nearly 2,000 stereographs, so I have become very familiar with them. Like if I were to do this show today, it would just all be stereos, 100% stereos. They wouldn't let me do it like that, but that's what I want to do. And I think stereos are so interesting, partly because of how they're meant to be viewed as a three-dimensional image. And they're made by taking two images at a slightly different offset angle, kind of made to like mimic your eyesight. You know, you close one eye, you open, things seem like they're in different places. Same principle. And when you view that through a special viewer called a stereoscope, it produces a three-dimensional image. And this particular stereograph is a daguerreotype. And daguerreotypes were the first publicly announced photographic process. And when we say photography was invented in 1839, that was the year the daguerreotype process was officially shared with the world by Louis Daguerre. And the daguerreotype was very popular, especially in America, throughout the 1840s and 1850s. And daguerreotypes are sort of one-off, unique images. The plate that goes in the camera is also the finished product, and they're very reflective. So it actually is kind of hard to achieve the three-dimensional effect when you're looking at a stereograph daguerreotype. So these things kind of are more of a novelty. This particular stereodag is of Niagara Falls, which is a classic tourist destination nearby if you're based in Rochester like we are here at the Eastman. And traveling for pleasure predates photography, obviously. People were traveling for pleasure hundreds of years before photography came around. But you can really see how immediate the impact of tourism was on photography even in these early days. Like what people are choosing to photograph are destinations like Niagara Falls, which were already well-established tourist destinations, because they knew it was something that people would want to see. But daguerreotypes weren't working very well for stereographs. Then comes albumen paper and also the use of negatives. So now you have the ability to produce lots of photographs. And albumen stereographs were one of the first, if not the first, mass-produced forms of photography. Here we have two other stereos I included, also Niagara Falls themed. They are both albumen silver prints, and the William England view over here on the left, this one right here, has been hand colored with pigment to enhance it and to make it look even more like you're really there. which was the purpose of stereos. You're making this three-dimensional image, so it's like you're really at the scene you're viewing. And I think stereographs are a great look into tourism of the 19th century, and even into the 20th century. They are popular from the 1850s all the way up into the 1920s and even a little beyond that. So if you went on a trip, you could buy views of where you were visiting to bring back and share, or even order views of distant places you wouldn't be traveling to, but were interested in seeing. And there was a big armchair tourism culture built around stereographs, where you can invite your friends and family over to have stereo viewing parties. So you could share where you had been, like sharing your vacation photos, except people couldn't take their own photos at the time. So they were just buying these already like pre-made professional photograph stereos. And, or, just looking at them for fun. One of the pieces of technology that is also in this exhibit is a stereo viewer that holds up to 25 stereos. So you could just flip through them. There are even ones that hold like 100 stereos. In the Boyer collection, in their stereo collection, there's actually another collection within it that was about 400 stereos that were owned by just one family, who must have just been really into stereos and really enjoyed using them. They're really interesting pieces. They have little notes in the back about places they had traveled, and their own experiences at the place to photograph. And the second stereo is of Tuscarora women selling their beadwork at Niagara Falls. And this is a very direct example of cultural tourism. The Tuscarora Reservation is less than 10 miles from Niagara Falls. So tribal members would often take things to sell to the visiting tourists. And you can still find actually a lot of the beaded whimsies you see in this one, like these little very beautiful objects that are beaded. And usually they'll actually even say like Niagara Falls. And in turn, these tourists got to experience a little bit of Tuscarora culture and even take home some of that culture as souvenirs. But stereographs and other photographs such as these also kind of position the Tuscarora as part of the scenery of Niagara Falls. And you might also note that the stereograph caption contains the word squaw, which is considered a derogatory term for Native women today. And it's something that as a cataloger, I will acknowledge in the record, but usually in like the display title will change. So now it says Tuscarora women. And another aspect of tourism and photography I wanted to explore was the grand tour. And the grand tour was seen as an essential part of the education of usually wealthy young men, but any person of means could take this trip. And it was informal. It wasn't like a guided tour you can book today, but it was a tour of the various European cultural centers and important sites from antiquity, like the Roman Forum. Here we have an image of the Colosseum. And the grand tour and its stops were well established when photography came around. The grand tour had existed from like the 17th century on. So naturally, these places were among some of the first to be photographed. And the Boyer collection holds around 400 negatives and salted paper positives taken by the Irish hobbyist photographer John Shaw Smith. And a lot of these images come from his 1850 to 1852 grand tour of Italy, Greece, Turkey, Egypt, the Sinai Peninsula, Palestine, Lebanon, Syria, Malta, and Switzerland. It was an almost 2-year trip, so he got to a lot of places. And given the length of time it took to places then, spreading your vacation out over multiple years was doable and common, which sounds nice. But these two images, one on the left is the calotype negative, and the one on the right is the positive that would be created from the negative, are both by John Shaw Smith. But his photographs give us an early and extensive look at these tourist sites of the 1850s. And it also shows us someone recording their own journey through photographs, essentially just for himself, and I think his wife was with him as well. Which wasn't something that really happened because camera technology was basically used by professional photographers who were like making commercial images at this time. And so just as objects, these are interesting. They're made using an early process called a calotype photographic process. And so the negative here on the left is made of waxed paper. And the black in the negative is actually ink. The exposure times for these were so long that the sky would always come out pretty blank. So often they would just kind of, to keep it as blank as possible, would fill this in with ink, like mask it off. And these little tabs are for when it was printed. So that would go in the printing frame, and these were contact printed. So you would sandwich the negative and your sensitized paper together in a frame and put that in the sunlight to produce a positive that you see right here. And another Grand Tour adjacent figure was British photographer Francis Frith. And he recorded a lot of early views of Egypt and the surrounding area using wet collodion and the albumin silver process. And these views were compiled into albums like Lower Egypt, Thebes, and the Pyramids that this image came out of. And it was published for those armchair tourists back home in England. And photography is kind of viewed as showing the utmost truth of a place, especially in those early days of photography. So having an image of a place was kind of the same as visiting yourself at this time. Frith even published a book of stereographs of Egypt, so anyone with the funds to purchase it could experience Egypt in 3D. And this modern piece by the duo of Francois and Daniel Cartier looks back on the legacy of the Grand Tour and the history of travel photography. They used found objects, slides they purchased at a market taken by Johannes Gans in the 1800s, and they combined it with pictures they took on a trip to Kaunas, Lithuania. So it makes this really great layering of time and travel, and you have these sculptural heads literally looking back at the legacy of the Grand Tour and this image of Pompeii, which was one of the stops along the tour often. Another aspect of tourism I was interested in exploring was how the individual tourists recorded their trips. So as I said earlier, it wasn't very common early on for tourists to be recording their own trips. One of the early ways of documenting your trip was by purchasing photographs made by professional photographers at your destination. And you would collect all these various photographs that were commercially made, and then you would bind them into an album. And these two images of the Great Pyramid are from an album that documented a trip from Berlin to Cairo. And you can kind of see in the image that one of the people on the trip wrote down a bunch of facts about the pyramids and even a little bit about their experience, their own personal experience climbing the pyramids. And as transportation began to advance, as travel became easier, as the world was opening up, camera technology was also advancing. And the introduction of the Kodak camera in 1888 meant that tourists could start taking their own pictures instead of purchasing those like commercial images from professional photographers. So you could take your Kodak and take it with you and take your own photos. And I included the back of one of these ones because it says in French, basically, photography by all and for all, although that is a Google translation. So if I get it kind of wrong, forgive me. But with the introduction of the Kodak camera, anyone could be a photographer. These also show that the popularity of grand tour stops like Pompeii was also still, and even the Sphinx were also still, they're still very popular stops, even almost 50 years after John Shaw Smith photographed some of the same places. And I also included, because I thought it was interesting, a photograph of the travel itself. And this is a photograph someone took on the steam ocean liner Umbria on their way to see all of these sites. And even with this new Kodak camera, the photos you took still had to be sent away to be developed. This object I could not include in the exhibition due to size constraints, but I love it a lot. It's an album of cyanotypes and gelatin silver prints that documents a group trip through Colorado, Utah, and California right at the turn of the century. There's pictures from the New Year's celebration of 1899, 1900. And it's kind of like looking through someone's old-timey Instagram feed. And it was around this time that pre-made photographic paper had been introduced to the market. So even amateur photographers could print their own images. So we've gone from having to buy commercial photographs in like the 1870s on your trip to being able to take your own photographs, but not developing them yourself in the 1890s to now at 1900. You can both take and print your own images of your vacation. So these cyanotypes were probably taken, printed, and put together in this album by the people in the pictures. And eventually you can even take it a step further with this real photo postcard from the 1951. And you could send your photographs to others. You could buy this pre-made photographic paper that was postcard sized, and on the back it has all prepped up to be sent in the mail, and send images of yourself on vacation to your loved ones back home. And you can kind of see the, as we continue with snapshot photography, this piece by Martin Parr. I love Martin Parr's work, and I was excited I got to include a piece by him. And his series, Small World, explores the divide between the mythology of a tourist destination, that like idealized and perfect image, and the reality. And also how the very act of taking a photograph has become part of what we perceive tourism to be. Like nowadays, you think of a tourist, you think of someone with like a camera around their neck. Although nowadays it's like everyone has phones, so everyone's a photographer on vacation. And that's how it's become part of like, you got to have a photo to prove you were there. So Parr here is capturing this gaggle of tourists doing the classic pose of holding the tower up. And most of them in his image are just getting air. It's a very comical image, looking at tourists and kind of how ridiculous tourism is in the 90s following. And this is a little aside into another area that I wish I had been able to explore a little deeper, was photographers native to a location who were creating views for outside consumption. And this photograph by Kusakabe Kimbe came from another tourist album, similar to the Berlin to Cairo album. This is a little later, from around 1890. And it was created using these professional commercial photographs that had been purchased and compiled during a trip to Japan by a Danish tourist who had owned the album. And Kimbe, the photographer, had learned photography from Western photographers who had come to Japan. And his photography was marketed towards those Western tourists. And they often depict these very beautiful, idealized, traditional scenes of Japanese life because that's what appealed to visitors. And so everyone in this photograph is dressed in traditional clothing, but you can still see some of the Western influence that was entering Japan, like this one guy has a top hat. So I think it's very interesting to think about how like that mythology of place is made, like how we view tourist destinations, even if you live there. And this image by Laladin Dayal, who was an Indian photographer, he was trained under Western photographers as well. And in 1897, he was appointed by royal warrant as the photographer to Queen Victoria. And he was commissioned to document Indian architecture by the British for publication in like England. So he was he was an Indian photographer who was bringing these views of India, not for an Indian audience, but for a British audience. And this was tied a lot to like colonization of India at the time and how we're kind of portraying Indian architecture. You know, it looks a little like run down, maybe like a little dirty, and how that like kind of justifies the British coming in and like, well, we're going to improve it. And that probably wasn't the intention of the photographer, but that's kind of how it was used. And changing gears a little again, we're going to talk about national parks. National parks are super interesting, especially from a photography standpoint. Carlton Watkins here is one of the best known early documenters of the Yosemite region in California. And his photographs introduced many people to the natural wonders of the area and may have even been a factor in establishing the federal land for public use. And I like this photo because it shows a fun, popular photo spot for tourists that still exists today. And the giant tunnel tree, which still exists in Yosemite National Park. You can't drive through it, but visitors can hike through the tunnel. And it wasn't just tourists and surveyors documenting these sites. Eventually, even art photographers were coming to these natural spaces. Here we have an image of Alvin Langdon Coburn taking photographs at the Grand Canyon. This was taken actually by his mother. And so you have people flocking to these natural tourist destinations like the Grand Canyon. You have everyone coming, not just interested tourists, but you also have artists. And so that brings us to Ansel Adams. And this classic vista of Yosemite National Park showcases the immensity and natural beauty of the park. And Adams was known for these highly detailed photographs with his large format camera, and that emphasized both the technical precision of the camera and like the purity of nature. And his images helped to popularize the national parks. I mean, they're so beautiful. Don't you want to go visit here? And also, at the same time, helped to popularize the idea that these natural spaces were absent of people. I mean, you look at this photograph, there's no people in it. It's just a beautiful scene. And this is kind of one of the negative sides of tourism, because in reality, the area of Yosemite had been home to Native people for thousands of years. And beginning in the 1850s, when they started to explore Yosemite and see the value in the views and the land, tribes such as the Miwok and Northern Paiute began to be removed from the land that would soon be designated as a national park. So there's a lot of good and bad in tourism photography. And part of that is comes from how tourism photography is used. This is from a series by Margaret White that she did for the Trans World Airlines, TWA, to advertise destinations. A lot of her photographs from this series are actually of planes. So this one is interesting because it's a landscape. To kind of give you the idea of like being up in a plane. Don't you want to fly somewhere, see this beautiful vista yourself? But Advertising and tourism and photography go incredibly hand in hand. Advertisers were harnessing the power of photography to capture the world and hiring these professional photographers to create these idealized images that would appeal to a lot of people, but it also added into like that mythology of place. Again, how we're creating this idealized image of a place while not necessarily connecting to what is actually the actual reality and history of these places. And this piece by Roger Minnick kind of shows how over time the tourists themselves have become part of that scenery. Like you go to Yosemite, you expect to see busloads and busloads of tourists nowadays. And you have this further commodification of natural spaces as tourism increases. And this woman is wearing a scarf that she probably purchased at a Yosemite gift shop that shows the view she's looking out on, Inspiration Point, and also some of the waterfalls. And I can personally attest to how ingrained the presence of the tourist is at Yosemite. The worst bathroom I had ever been into in my entire life was at Glacier Point in Yosemite. And that had a lot to do with the sheer volume of people that move through the park on a daily basis now. So it's something interesting to think of how we've gone from a space occupied by people that wasn't photographed before it was photographed to this, we're taking these idealized images of an empty landscape to now this, where you're seeing these images, but that it's full of tourists just out of the sight of the camera. And I couldn't fit this one in the show, very sad. Everyone loves a dinosaur, but this is a photograph by Steve Fitch. And I wanted to include it here just to talk a little about the road trip. And as the car became more widely available and highways expanded, the American road trip was born. And competition for travelers' attention along these roads gave rise to tourist traps, like these giant plaster dinosaurs. And this led to the kind of uniquely American popular culture that photographers like Steve Fitch love to capture. But that popular American culture is also deriving from those like idealized kind of stereotypical, you get a lot of cool things like dinosaurs, but also a lot of like caricatures happening along Route 66. And in that same vein, we have this photograph of Cadillac Ranch in Amarillo, Texas by Robert Whitcomb. This is one of Route 66's most iconic tourist spots. By the time this photograph was made, color photography was like widely available, but it was mostly used by amateurs for like snapshot photography. Most art photographers at this time were still shooting in like black and white. So by choosing to document the site in color, this tourist spot, Whitcomb is kind of giving a little nod back to those tourist sensibilities that have helped to make the mythology of Route 66 and all the stops along it. And as we move further into the now of tourism, we have to include things like Disneyland, Disney World, and theme parks and things. And so this piece by Melissa Ann Pinney is a piece from the women's washroom at Disney World in Florida from her series regarding Emma. And her work deals mainly with female identity from childhood to old age across a wide range of women. Here she documents an aspect of the family trip that is not typically photographed, while also speaking to like womanhood and societal norms. And so by depicting this crowded restroom at Disney World, she shows how the burden of childcare often falls to female caregivers, even during a vacation, but also how families and tourists are now drawn to these specific sites made for them, like Disney World. And speaking of sites, tourist sites, in this series entitled Postcards, Hu Zhiming just juxtaposes archetypal images of China with ones from the modern world in which he lives. And he accomplishes this by selecting the most visited sites in China, like this one, the Great Wall, that is most representative of what a Western audience expects China to be like. And he superimposed images from advertising and media he encounters in his daily life in China. So this goes back to the thinking of how someone native to a destination experiences it so differently than someone who's just visiting and only knows it from the images they've seen. So you have this sort of like idealized, sanitized version versus like the everyday in and out life of someone who lives there. And as we move further and further from the typical idea of tourist photography, we enter a more conceptual space. I love this piece by our very own Nick Marshall. It uses found objects and it kind of confronts the memory of vacation. In this case, a beach vacation. And it kind of also plays into that mythology of tourist destinations, like how you visit a place, you take a photograph and you look at your photograph and you're remembering your imagined destination, you know, like you're remembering your experience there, but you don't necessarily have the entire picture of it. It's kind of disconnected and floating in the space of your memory. And I wanted to end by talking about cultural tourism, which revolves around the appreciation of arts, traditions, culture, and history of a place or group of people. And this photograph shows a Native American woman dancing for a crowd. And many cultures have events where they perform aspects of their traditions for outside audiences. But these performances are usually specifically for tourists, for that outsider consumption. And I love how in this photograph that lens flare from the light is obscuring her face. So you're getting the act of the dance, but you don't necessarily know the person, the woman herself. And the final piece I'm going to talk about is by the late Shan Goshorn. It's a study for a basket. And I'm going to play a short video for this one because this is the only object that's not just like a traditional sort of photograph I chose. It's a study for a basket. So I'm going to show a short video. I'm going to switch my screen real quick so you can get an idea of what her full works, three-dimensional baskets look like, and also learn a little bit more about her own works.
I started creating political baskets by weaving together reproductions of documents, treaties, maps, photographs, and other things in a traditional Cherokee format to create baskets that address issues that are unique to Indian people today. I taught myself to weave, which is an unusual thing because usually in my tribe, basket makers learn from somebody in their family by watching their mother as a child or watching an uncle or, you know, an aunt, somebody that makes them in the family, and they just pick it up by observing. I've been a human rights activist with my work for over 20 years, but what I found when I would do presentations to organizations or colleges is that people literally would fold their hands across their chest and back up. It was just too confrontational, it was too angry, it was too in your face. And I didn't deliberately go into making baskets thinking that this would be different, but it was. People lean into the basket and want to know about the process, they want to know about the historical photographs. They're engaged in this dialogue that's been the goal of mine as a professional artist, you know, the entire time I've been an artist, that's been my goal, is to get people to understand these issues and enter into conversation about it. And something about this vessel form, the technique, the finished product, I don't know what it is, something about these baskets make people receptive and open to learning more about it. To be able to convey some of these issues and show how, you know, to educate how important this is, both to Indian and non-Indian people, to show how this still affects us. I don't want to be homogenized. I want people to respect the culture that's ours and quit appropriating from it, quit stealing from it, quit misinterpreting it, and respect it for what it is.
So back to the PowerPoint. Sorry. So this piece by Shang Goshorn uses two photographs taken by John Choate at the Carlisle Indian Industrial School of a Dene or Navajo student, Hastine Tohali, who was renamed Tom Torlino during his time at the school. And so this is a before and after photograph. You can see on the bottom the before and after. And these photographs appeared in booklets such as Souvenir of the Carlisle Indian School, and they were made specifically for white consumption. And they were immensely popular with audiences who were eager to experience a culture that was seen as vanishing. In residential schools like Carlisle or scattered across the United States and Canada, we had one just south of Buffalo on the Cataloguer Reservation. And they were created with the purpose of erasing the cultures of Native people and assimilating them into Western culture. So in her piece, Goshorn recontextualizes the photos and meshes the two photographs back into one whole using these traditional Cherokee weaving techniques that reinforce the survival of Native peoples and cultures. So this is one of the areas where kind of tourism is a little negative, like the desire to consume this culture was not in a good or appropriate way. And I'm ending on this piece because I think it's a very timely piece. I don't know if everyone has heard of the Every Child Matters movement, but it's focused on bringing light and justice to children who never got away from those schools. And this piece actually was a little personal for me because when I was doing the research into the student from Carlisle, I happened to look up my great-grandmother who also attended that school. And the same photographer, John Choate, had also taken a picture of her, and I didn't even know about it. So this is just one of the ways where like that early tourism culture still has an impact, you know, years down the line. And so I just think tourism is just such a fascinating subject. And I thought it was a really, really fun and interesting topic to tackle. And so if anyone has any questions, you can start asking them now.
Thanks, Lily. That was great. The first question that came in was, how did photo postcards fit into the history?
The history of
photography, or the history of tourism.
I think it's just like another pre-made photographic paper that you could do and put out there. I think they came out about in the 1930s, maybe. I don't quite remember. Yeah, they were just like another way that the, cameras were coming into more and more hands. So more and more people wanted to share their photos. So it's just another way to share your photo. So you could send destination photos and stuff to people you knew.
And out of the 400,000 plus objects that are in the photography collection, like, how do you start your search for something like this? How do you whittle it down to what, 33?
33. Yeah.
Photographs?
Very hard.
Yeah.
It's luckily we have a lot of good catalogers now, so a lot of things are becoming easier and easier to find within the collection through like searching.
It's like keyword searching, or
like keyword searching, and just I think I did a lot of searching by date and by like material. I wanted to kind of include a lot of different processes as well. And then just as my job as a cataloger, I go through thousands of objects a year. And so I see a lot of things, and a lot of these things I had, like the John Shaw Smith, I cataloged myself, and just like going through stereos and getting ideas from physically being with the collection.
Well, hopefully you'll get to do your stereo show someday. Quite a few of us who would love to see that happen at some time. The dinosaur piece that was cut, were there any other works that you had kind of on the fringe of wanting to include in this exhibition for the collection that I know that one was a very last minute cut, but were there any others that you kind of had on the kind of fringe there? And you don't have to mention names, but I guess, was that process just really kind of strictly based on like not like trying to show a swath of the collection and trying to not kind of like duplicate efforts?
Yeah, and sort of trying to stick to like the basic subjects. I got away from some of them because some of the things I had picked had gotten cut. I had a lot more like road trip ones originally, but that just wouldn't fit or couldn't be displayed for various reasons.
Playlist.
Oh yeah, and I made a road trip playlist if anyone wants a good mix of like dad rock and some newer stuff.
Yeah, it's really great, and it's available on the website, right? On our website,
So it's available through Spotify. So if you have Spotify, and
I think the link should be available on our website for the exhibition page. And hopefully we'll have a virtual exhibition on our website as well. Usually that happens about 2-3 weeks after an exhibition is open. So if you're joining us streaming from outside of the area and you're interested to see how it looks in the space, you will have that opportunity in a few weeks. And yes, Kate just posted the link to learning more about the exhibition, access to the playlist there in the chat. So if you want to follow that, you can. Someone had typed into the chat here that there was a long history of commercial photo postcards that were vended at the tourist venues. Is there anything there's something certainly, like, I think like with all of this, like this commodification of tourism and the topic of our In Focus next month is on Kodak picture spots. Coincidentally, these two happen to be back to back. So if anybody is interested in hearing more about that, Leslie K. Brown, who's a scholar and has done a significant amount of research and written on the topic of picture spots, which for those that don't know, were essentially roadside markers across the country. A lot of national parks, Disney World had them, and they were essentially pointing the photographer, saying, you know, this is what you should be taking a picture of. And it's interesting. I feel like the photo postcards kind of do a similar thing, where it creates this generic, I don't know if I would say generic, but you know,
Yeah.
it's sort of in a way. I don't know. Did you have anything you wanted to say more about the photo postcards?
Oh, just like I know that they existed, like where they were sold photo postcards, but also you could make your own as well.
Yeah, I always kind of wondered about that because I've certainly seen them in my family albums, and and there's this like weird thing of like there's like photo postcards, but then there's like a portrait on it, and I don't recognize the person, and I just like I wonder what the origin of that who that person is, what the origin of the photo postcard is. Is this a famous person that just, you know, is on a postcard? Is this a postcard from someone else that got sent to my family? I love that way that these things kind of end up in our collections, family albums, and then kind of what is the interpretation of those without, you know, very little context, or understanding. And I like that. Well, Lilia, if you don't have any thing else you want to add, we can wrap things up now, and so I will turn it to you.
Okay, I have nothing to add. Just come see the show. I believe we have a viewer to, if you want to try to see the stereo daguerreotype in 3 dimensions yourself.
We do. It's very cool. I was stereo daguerreotype. It's just like a really mind-blowing thing that they exist in the first place. But I mean, it's just such a beautiful object. So yeah, thank you, Lily. Thank you all for joining us. Hope to see you next month at our next In Focus. Thank you all. Bye.